The sun had barely climbed over the horizon when the military trucks rolled through the dust outside Amarillo, Texas, in the early spring of 1944. The engines coughed, sputtered, and died, leaving behind only the high, ceaseless sound of cicadas and a low wind pushing through the mesquite trees. Inside one of the trucks sat a group of German prisoners, not combat soldiers, but women. Their khaki uniforms were creased, and their eyes were hollow from weeks of transport across oceans and borders, reflecting the immense fatigue and psychological terror of the journey. Among them was 24-year-old Lieselot Minhart, a former Luftwaffe radio operator captured near Cherbourg. She had been a dedicated servant of the Reich's air defense network. She had imagined America as a vast, unforgiving cage of steel and fire, a land ruled by cold machinery and avarice. Every rumor from home, meticulously crafted by the Reich's propaganda machine, had told her the same story. Captured Germans would be beaten, starved, humiliated, or made to dig their own graves under the desert sun. For the women, the fear was even sharper, fueled by sinister whispers of forced labor camps and abuse. The truck doors creaked open. Lieselot braced for the familiar barking shouts, for the crack of a rifle butt. But instead a calm voice spoke, slow and strange in its rhythm. "Ma'am, watch your step." A man in a tan hat stood waiting, his sleeves rolled up, dust on his boots. He wasn't a guard in a uniform. He looked precisely like the men she had only ever seen in pre-war Western films. A Texas cowboy. Behind him, the Texas skies stretched so wide it seemed utterly unreal, a continuous, seamless dome of blue reaching the very edge of the earth. Lieselot blinked in confusion. The air smelled of horses and hay, not gunpowder or stale fear. Around her, other women climbed down hesitantly, clutching their small canvas bags. There were no chains, no frantic shouting, just a few American soldiers leaning on their rifles, watching without malice. The cowboy handed Lieselot a tin cup of water. It was icy cold, cleaner than anything she'd tasted since France. She drank it all at once. He nodded, a simple, non-judgmental gesture. Plenty more where that came from. She was speechless. Back home, they had been taught Americans were savages, a nation of criminals and factory slaves who lived only for money and machines. Yet here, standing in the soft heat of a Texas morning, she saw something that absolutely did not fit the stories. Cattle moved lazily beyond the boundary fences. Windmills turned slowly in the vast distance. A ranch dog barked, chasing shadows in the dust. The cowboy pointed toward the stables. "You folks will be helping out here," he said, his voice practical. "Feeding, cleaning, riding if you're up for it." Riding? She almost laughed out loud. She had expected shackles, not saddles. When the camp gates, a simple wooden barrier rather than an iron fortress, closed behind them, Lieselot turned to look back at the open plains. For the first time since her capture, she felt a powerful emotion she hadn't experienced in months. Curiosity. She whispered to herself, half in disbelief, half in wonder. This is America. She had been taught to fear a monster. Instead, she found a nation so confident in its own power and security that it didn't need to hate or torture its enemies. It was a land where prisoners were given horses, not chains. The Reich's propaganda machine had made sure every German, man or woman, believed capture meant death or degradation. But the reality was fundamentally different. By 1944, America had become the world's largest warden of prisoners, holding over 400,000 captured Axis soldiers and civilians on its own soil. Instead of punishing them, the U.S. Army followed the Geneva Conventions with an almost obsessive precision. Prisoners were paid small wages for labor, allowed to write letters, attend religious services, and even learn English in camp schools. The logic was not sentimental, it was profoundly practical. America had lost millions of young men to overseas service. Food still had to be grown. Cattle had to be tended. Cotton had to be harvested. German POWs filled this critical labor gap. But to Lieselot and her fellow captives, this practicality looked like something else entirely. Compassion. The first night she sat on her bunk, staring at a plate of food she didn't believe she deserved. Beef stew, fresh bread, butter, and even a slice of apple pie. She couldn't eat. She truly thought it was a test, or worse, poisoned. But by the next morning, simple, profound hunger defeated fear. They ate, and they realized something astonishing. The enemy they'd been taught to despise fed them better than their own army ever had. The American system ran on logistics, providing each prisoner with 3,200 calories a day, more than many American civilians were getting, let alone German civilians existing on thin ration cards. In one of her first letters home, Lieselot wrote a heavily censored truth. "They told us we would be slaves, but here even the guards say good morning. The sky is enormous, and the food tastes of mercy." For German women raised under a dictatorship that measured worth only in obedience, the greatest shock was not the material comfort, it was the dignity. America didn't need to humiliate its captives to prove its power. That quiet, unshakable confidence, embodied by the calm patience of the cowboy, would soon begin to dismantle everything they had believed about the war. By the spring of 1944, America had become the largest prison keeper in modern history, managing over 400,000 Axis prisoners across the country. In Texas alone, more than 70 major camps were scattered across the plains, sprawling installations surrounded by wheat fields and mesquite. These camps, while uniform in architecture, rows of wooden barracks, mess halls, workshops, were revolutionary in their philosophy. Unlike the barbed wire brutality of Axis facilities in Europe or Asia, American POW camps were designed not to crush morale, but to control it through order and decency. The military logic was coldly efficient. A well-fed, busy prisoner caused fewer problems, required fewer guards, and, most importantly, became a quiet ambassador of American superiority when the war ended. To military planners, this was psychological warfare of the most subtle kind. When the U.S. War Department began receiving captured German women in 1944, mostly nurses, clerks, and auxiliary personnel from the Luftwaffe, they faced an unprecedented logistical question: where to safely house and utilize them? The solution was the vast open spaces of Texas, which became a natural location for experimental POW labor programs that could include women. Many of these women arrived at installations like Camp Hearn or Camp Swift before being assigned to smaller work details. The rules were simple: obey, work, and you would be treated fairly. Logistics as a weapon. The daily life inside the American system was a constant assault on the German women's rigid, ideological beliefs. The sheer logistics of abundance was the most immediate shock. Every prisoner received the specified 3,200 calories a day: bread, beef, potatoes, vegetables, and fruit, which felt like wealth beyond reason to those accustomed to ration cards and thin soup. Lieselot Minhart and her comrades observed that the same industrial might that built tanks and bombers also fed its captives. Lieselot wrote in her diary, analyzing the enemy's strength: "Every crate, every meal, every uniform fits into a plan. Nothing is wasted. They build everything like a machine that never sleeps." She began to understand that American power wasn't just about armies. It was about organization, production, and seemingly endless resources. The work assignments soon became as varied as the Texas landscape. While some male prisoners harvested cotton under the punishing sun, the women were often assigned to ranch work, where they cooked, mended, or tended livestock. For them, this was a world beyond comprehension. American soldiers were trusting captured Germans with horses, tools, and a degree of freedom of movement. The morning the work detail arrived at the Callahan Ranch, the air smelled of hay and dust. Lieselot stood among 24 women, her uniform faded but neat. They expected chains, hard labor, or a whip. But instead of armed guards and barking dogs, they saw men in wide-brimmed hats and denim shirts leaning casually against pickup trucks. Real cowboys. Their leader, a tall rancher named Frank Callahan, greeted them with a wide grin and a lazy wave. "Morning, ladies. You all ready to work?" His accent was so thick and cheerful that the interpreter had to repeat his words twice. Trust, disguised as madness. When they arrived at the Callahan Ranch, the shock only deepened. Instead of fences topped with barbed wire, there were open fields stretching to the horizon, dotted with herds of cattle and horses grazing under the vast sky. The first order of business, Frank announced, was not punishment but breakfast. Bacon sizzling in iron skillets, biscuits, eggs, and strong coffee. The women sat in stunned silence at a long wooden table. No guards stood behind them. No one shouted orders. After breakfast came the most astonishing surprise. Frank led them to a corral where several horses waited, saddled and restless. "You'll be learning to ride," he said with a genuine smile. "Can't herd cattle on foot, and y'all are going to help us drive them in next week." Laughter rippled nervously through the group. Lieselata whispered, "He's joking." But Frank wasn't. Within minutes, the ranch hands were pairing each woman with a horse, offering gentle instruction in broken German and simple pantomime. At first, it was chaos. Skirts tangled, saddles slipped, and shrieks echoed as frightened mares bolted. The cowboys laughed, not cruelly but warmly, helping each woman back into the saddle. "Don't fight her," one drawled. "Just feel the rhythm. She'll carry you if you trust her." By noon, the women were covered in dust and sweat, but they were laughing. The fear that had gripped them for months began to melt under the Texas sun. For the first time since their capture, they were outside the wire, without guards at their backs. When Lieselot finally learned to guide her horse at a gentle trot, she felt a profound, personal sense of freedom, a feeling of motion, wind, and possibility she hadn't known since the war began. That night, back in the bunkhouse built for workers, Lieselot wrote in her journal, "They trust us. It is madness, but also perhaps kindness disguised as madness. They treat us not as enemies, but as people. I do not understand this America." Her confusion was shared by everyone in the group. They had been raised in a society that measured strength in domination and obedience. Here, strength looked like calm confidence, patience, and good humor. Even the cowboys' authority was different. They commanded through example, not shouting. This American way of life, built on respect and practicality, challenged everything the Reich had taught her. The transformation came quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. Within days, the German women found themselves treated less like prisoners and more like ranch hands by the men of the Callahan Ranch. Their only guards were the wide Texas skies, the rattling wind through the mesquite trees, and the watchful eyes of the cowboys, who treated them with a kind of rough, practical courtesy. Instead of iron fences, there were boundaries of trust. Frank Callahan explained the security situation plainly, his words cutting through the complex ideological layers the women carried. "You run, you'll die thirsty out there. You stay, you'll eat well and sleep easy. We're not your jailers, we're your neighbors till this war is done." Lieselot Minhart did not believe him at first. None of them did. But by the end of the first week, the truth became undeniable. The camp trucks came only once a week to deliver supplies, and no one meticulously counted heads. The women could have vanished into the vast open plains at any time, but they didn't. Why would they? Here, under the endless sky, they were working, laughing, and even learning. A life far safer and more abundant than anything they knew. The contrast of labor. The German POWs mended fences, milked cows, and learned to throw hay bales with the same exacting precision they once applied to factory work back home. More than once, the cowboys stood back and watched in quiet admiration. "Tougher than half the boys we've hired," one remarked. "And they don't complain, neither." Lieselata noticed how differently the Americans seemed to value work. In Germany, labor was duty, a grim necessity dictated by the state. Here, it was pride. The cowboys joked, sang, and competed in small, good-natured ways. Who could rope a calf fastest? Who could mend the longest stretch of fence before sundown? The concept of joy in labor was entirely foreign to a society built on forced conformity. Evenings brought another intense culture shock. Instead of being locked away, the women were invited to sit by the fire, where harmonicas and guitars turned the Texas dusk into something that felt almost sacred. At first, they sat apart, wary and uncertain, but the sound of the music worked on them slowly, breaking down the invisible wall between victor and vanquished. One night, when a cowboy began to hum Lily Marlene, the haunting song that every German soldier knew by heart, Lieselata found herself singing along before she realized it. The fire crackled, and voices blended, English and German, harmony and melody, until, for a few fleeting minutes, there were no enemies, only people bound by the same tune under the same stars. Afterward, Frank leaned back on his saddle and said softly, "War ends sooner when folks realize they were never that different." His simple wisdom contained a depth that dwarfed the complex, hateful rhetoric of Hitler's speeches. Authority and respect. The difference in leadership style was another constant lesson. The women had grown up under a military dictatorship where authority was absolute and derived from fear and rank. The cowboys commanded through example, patience, and good humor. When a horse refused to move, they didn't whip it, they waited, spoke softly, and tried again. It was leadership built on respect, not coercion. The work resumed the next morning, but everything felt lighter. The barriers of fear and suspicion were fading fast. One of the women, Anna, asked if she could learn to use a lasso. The cowboys obliged, teaching her with endless patience. Before long, the sight of a German POW twirling a rope over her head drew laughter from both sides. But what truly cemented the change came one stormy afternoon, when a fierce weather front rolled in fast from the west. The sky turned black, the wind howled, and lightning split the horizon. The cattle panicked, scattering across the fields in a terrifying stampede. Without hesitation, the women ran to help. They mounted horses, shouted, waved, and rode alongside the cowboys through sheets of rain and mud, helping drive the terrified herd back toward the pens. Hours later, drenched and shivering, they returned together, victorious. Not one animal was lost. Frank walked among them, his face streaked with rain and genuine pride. "Guess y'all ain't just city girls after all," he said with a grin. That night, the ranch hands quietly hung a hand-painted sign over the bunkhouse door. It read simply, "The German Cowgirls." Lieselot looked at it in disbelief, then laughed until tears came. Somewhere deep inside, a critical shift had occurred. The war, the propaganda, the crushing fear, it all seemed far away. What mattered now was survival, work, and the strange dignity of being trusted. In a world at war, she realized, that trust was rarer and more valuable than gold. By early autumn, the air on the Texas plains began to cool, and so too did the walls around the German women's hearts. The Great War still raged across Europe, but here, time seemed to move differently. The days were filled with honest work, and the nights with quiet laughter and the hum of crickets. For the first time since their capture, mail was allowed. Each woman received a single sheet of official camp stationery and was told she could write one letter home. The pages would be censored, of course, but even within these limits, it was a rare chance to speak to the world they'd left behind. That night, the bunkhouse was silent, except for the scratch of pencils on paper. Lieselot Minhart's hand trembled as she began. "Dearest Mother, I am alive, and I must tell you something you will not believe. I am working on a farm in Texas. They call it a ranch. The people here are kind. Yes, truly kind. They give us food. So much food I can hardly eat it all. They even let us ride horses. The men wear hats as wide as dishes and drink something called Coca-Cola. She paused, staring at the words. Would her mother think she had gone mad? The propaganda in Germany had painted American POW camps as brutal, inhumane places where prisoners were starved and beaten. But here, in this sun-drenched working paradise, she was drinking coffee every morning, learning to make chili, and riding a mare named Betsy. She continued, trying to convey the moral weight of their situation. Mama, they trust us. We could run, but we do not, because we are free in all the ways that matter. I never thought freedom could look like this. The fairy tales of the enemy. The letters were collected the next morning, but weeks later, when the replies came, they were carefully censored and trembling with disbelief. Liselot, are you sure? You must be mistaken. Perhaps you are dreaming. They would never treat prisoners so well. Her mother wasn't the only one who doubted. Other women received similar replies. Their families, still enduring bombing raids and surviving on ration cards back home, refused to believe tales of hamburgers, open fields, and friendly cowboys. To those in the ruins of the Reich, such a life sounded like a fantasy concocted by a mind broken by captivity. Even the American officers who reviewed the letters seemed faintly amused. "Y'all are writing fairy tales," one chuckled. "Ain't nobody gonna believe you over there." But the reality was undeniable. Each day, the German POWs rode deeper into a version of America that defied every ideological lesson they'd ever been taught. They saw it in the abundance. Eggs by the dozen, meat by the pound, sugar by the sack. They saw it in the machines. Tractors roaring across fields powered by seemingly endless gasoline. They saw it, crucially, in the attitude. No rigid hierarchy, no subservient bowing, no palpable fear. When Liselot finally worked up the courage to ask one cowboy why he treated them so kindly, he simply shrugged. "Lady, war's over for you when you get here. Ain't no use fighting ghosts." Time. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something more pragmatic, an American kind of mercy that measured worth by work, not by flag or political allegiance. The shattering sight. One afternoon, a new group of POWs arrived, male soldiers from another camp, to help with a larger cattle drive. They watched in open disbelief as the women led horses from the barn, laughing and chatting freely with the cowboys. "This cannot be real," one muttered in German, staring at the sight of his female comrades riding across open pastures without chains. But it was. For the newcomers, the sight of the women's physical health, their obvious contentment, and their easy interaction with the enemy shattered years of conditioning. It was the first undeniable proof that captivity under the Americans could be something other than total humiliation. And as those men joined the work crews, they too began to soften. The cowboys taught them to mend fences, throw ropes, and eventually to dance. By November, the Callahan Ranch had become something impossible, a small corner of reconciliation in a world still burning. For Liselot, it was the beginning of a quiet, profound revelation. Humanity could survive even in captivity, and kindness could grow from the ruins of war. She didn't yet know that these simple Texas lessons, trust, hard work, and good humor, would follow her home, reshaping everything she believed about the future of Germany. April 1945. The wind across the plains carried the scent of spring grass and rain. Calves had been born, the fields were greening again, and the rhythms of ranch life offered a strange, calming normalcy. But the rumors, swirling faster than the dust devils that chased each other across the pastures, were undeniable. Germany was collapsing. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler was dead, some said, while others desperately whispered it was propaganda. At the Callahan Ranch, the German women worked as usual, mending saddles, washing clothes, and herding cattle. But the tension in the air was palpable. The radio in Frank Callahan's kitchen, usually reserved for country music and baseball scores, now carried nothing but news bulletins from Europe. That afternoon, when Frank came out to the barn, his face was solemn. He held his hat in one hand, the other gripping a folded newspaper. "Ladies," he said quietly, his voice low but steady. "It's over." For a moment, no one spoke. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap that hadn't yet broken. "Over."
"What do you mean?"
Liselott asked in a whisper, her throat tight. "The war?" "The war," Frank confirmed. "Germany surrendered." Some women froze in place, their hands mid-motion. Others dropped the tools they were holding. Anna covered her mouth and began to cry softly. Liselott just stared at the ground, her mind blank. For years, everything, every breath, every fear, every loss had been tied to the war. Now, suddenly, it was gone. No one cheered. There was no celebration, only stunned silence and the distant lowing of cattle. The women gathered that night by the fire, their faces lit by the flickering orange light, unsure whether to feel relief or grief. They were safe, well-fed and warm. But the nation they had been prepared to die for had vanished in a cloud of dust and shame. Frank poured coffee for everyone, strong and black, and said quietly, "It's done now. You all can go home soon." The word home hit harder than any news of surrender. Home. What did that even mean anymore? Their towns might be gone, their families displaced or dead. Germany was rubble. Liselott sipped her coffee and watched the sparks drift up into the night. "What will we go back to?" she murmured. Frank didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone knew there was no easy answer. The farewell of trust. In the days that followed, the U.S. Army sent officers to process the prisoners for repatriation. Trucks arrived to transport them back to official camps where they would await ships bound for Europe. The Cowboys stood quietly by as the women packed their few belongings, mostly clothes, letters, and small trinkets carved from wood. Frank approached Liselott as she was folding her work gloves into a small canvas bag. "Reckon you'll be going home soon?" he said softly. She nodded, her throat tight with unspent emotion. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan, for everything." He smiled, his eyes squinting under the brim of his hat. "Ain't nothing to thank me for. You all worked hard, earned your keep. That's all any of us can do." Then, with a playful grin, he reached behind him and held out something wrapped in brown paper. "Got something for you." Inside was a brand new Stetson hat, cream-colored, soft as suede. "So you don't forget Texas," he said. Liselott laughed through tears. She put it on awkwardly, the wide brim shading her eyes. The ranch hands whooped and clapped, and someone shouted, "Yeehaw!" The German cowgirl rides again. The gift was more than a souvenir. It was a symbol of trust and earned equality. When the trucks finally rolled out, the women looked back through the wooden slats and saw the ranch fading into the distance, the barns, the windmill, the men waving their hats in farewell. For Liselott, that sight would never fade. It wasn't just a place, it was a revelation. She had come to Texas a prisoner of war and was leaving as something else, someone who had glimpsed a different way of living, where dignity came not from rank or fear, but from simple, shared respect. As the truck rumbled down the dusty road, she whispered to herself, "Maybe we lost the war, but perhaps we can still win peace." In that moment, watching the wide horizon of America disappear behind her, Liselott realized that the greatest freedom she had found wasn't physical, it was moral. She had seen the power of kindness, and it had changed her forever. The journey home took months. The war might have been over, but the ocean crossings were slow, and the Allied bureaucracy was slower still. The ship carrying Liselott Minhart and her fellow prisoners finally reached Bremerhaven, Germany. It was winter again, cold, gray, and broken. The docks were ruins. The city was flattened. What had once been bustling streets were now desolate rivers of rubble and wreckage. As the women stepped ashore, their breath turned white in the frigid air. This was their homecoming, but to a homeland that barely existed anymore. American officers handed them small care packages before they disembarked. Chocolate bars, canned food, and letters with instructions on where to go next. The sight of the American Red Cross logo on every box was both surreal and profoundly humbling. For years they had been taught that Americans were materialistic monsters, cruel and without honor. But now, standing amidst the ruins, holding a Hershey bar and still mentally wearing her Texas cowboy hat, Liselott felt the weight of that lie crumble completely. When she arrived in her hometown, what she found confirmed what she already knew in her heart. The war had devoured everything. Her house was gone, her parents were dead, and her village was burned. But in the ashes of destruction, she carried something the ruins could not erase. An idea she had learned under the Texas sun. The ambassador of a new reality. Liselott began working as a translator for the Allied occupation forces. Her English, learned not in a classroom but from cowboys and ranch hands, was rough and full of slang, but it got her noticed. American officers often smiled when she called them partner or used the word ain't. She told them stories of Texas ranches, of the wide skies, and of the astonishing kindness of the men who had treated prisoners not as enemies, but as human beings who had earned their keep. It astonished many American soldiers to hear it. They had expected tales of hardship and cruelty, not narratives of cattle drives, Coca-Cola, and the gift of a Stetson hat. In 1948, Liselott was invited to speak at a post-war women's conference in Stuttgart. The topic was rebuilding through understanding. She stood before an audience of German and Allied women, former enemies now seated side by side, and told them about her time in Texas. "I was a prisoner of war," she began softly, "but I never felt like one." She spoke of the cowboys who shared their food, of Frank Callahan's quiet dignity, and of the day she first wore that Stetson and felt, perhaps for the first time, equal. "I learned that freedom," she said, her voice clear, "is not given by nations. It is given by people, one act of kindness at a time." Her words moved the crowd. When she finished, an American woman came forward and embraced her. It was a visible moment of reconciliation. A German and an American, once enemies, now sisters. The return to Texas. Years later, Liselott immigrated to the United States. She settled in San Antonio, Texas, not far from where she had once worked as a POW. She opened a small bakery that became known for its unique fusion of German pastries and Southern flavors: apple strudel with pecan crumble, pretzels dusted with smoked salt. Above the counter hung a framed photograph. A young woman in 1945 wearing a cowboy hat too big for her head, standing beside a tall rancher with a shy smile. Beneath it, a simple inscription read, "From enemies to friends." When people asked her about it, she would always say, "That's the man who taught me what America really is." By the time Liselott passed away, she had become a quiet symbol of reconciliation in her community. Former POWs, both men and women, would visit her bakery, trading memories of war and the strange mercy they had found in the most unlikely of places. Historians now confirm that these unique POW experiences played a quiet but vital role in shaping post-war relations between Germany and the United States. Thousands of former prisoners returned home with stories of fairness, decency, and compassion. They became the first human bridges in a world desperate to rebuild trust. In the end, it wasn't treaties or governments that began the true healing. It was the simple decency of ordinary people. And on a dusty Texas ranch in 1945, a cowboy with a gentle heart had done more to mend the wounds of war than any diplomat ever could. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't won on the battlefield. It is earned in the quiet grace of trust and forgiveness.